And in fact, noted been a medical reason for criminalizing marijuana. I looked through the history of this if you're interested. I don't know if you want me to run through it, but it's an interesting history. Marijuana was criminalized. See, very commonly, substances are criminalized because they're associated with what are called the dangerous classes. You know, poor people or working people. So, for example, in England in the 19th century, there was a period when gin was criminalized and whiskey wasn't, because gin is what poor people drank. That's kind of like the sentencing for crack and powder. You know, when in the early stages of Prohibition in the United States, one of the targets was immigrant workers. You know, these guys hanging around the saloons in New York. Got to go after them. The rich guys in upstate New York, they're going to drink no matter what. You know, they want to come home after work, they'll drink. But go after those guys. What about marijuana? And marijuana was brought in by Mexicans. And the first criminalization of marijuana was in the Southwest, in the States. It was in New Mexico, later Utah, and so on. And it was specifically targeted against Mexicans. It didn't get criminalized in the United States until shortly after Prohibition ended. After Prohibition ended, we had this huge Bureau of Narcotics, and they had to do something. So they discovered, you know, that marijuana is going to do all kind of horrible things to you. The Senate testimony about this is mind-boggling. They did have a representative of the American Medical Association who said we don't have any medical evidence about this. He was shut up, denounced, you know, they got rid of him right away. Then they found somebody else. This is literally true. They found a pharmacologist, a guy teaching at Temple University, who was doing experiments with marijuana in dogs. Okay. And they brought this guy in to test. The testimony is hilarious. You know, you really have to read it. They brought this guy, and he testified that when he gave marijuana to dogs, they went insane. You know, they did all kind of things. And then some senator or somebody asked him. This is from memory, so it's probably a little off, but something like this. It was in the 30s. They asked the guy, "Well, have you ever tried marijuana on humans?" So he said, "Yeah, I tried it on himself." And he said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "I turned into a vulture. I started flying around the room, you know." So oh my God, this stuff is terrible. It makes people insane. And marijuana, it was declared by Congress that marijuana makes people insane. But then something happened. It turned out that lawyers, defense lawyers, got the idea, okay, I can use this for an insanity defense. So if a guy was found, you know, who killed 3 cops, his lawyer would say, well, you know, he had marijuana before, so he was insane, so he can't do anything. And people were getting off on charges, you know, like cop killing, for example, on the claim that they had marijuana. So all of a sudden it was discovered that marijuana doesn't make you insane. Congress decided, sorry, it doesn't make you insane because we want to wipe that out. The next idea was marijuana is an entry drug. It's the drug you take and then you go on to something else. Well, there was never any evidence for that. But that was decided. And then in the early 50s, something else happened. Marijuana is being brought in here by red Chinese to poison the American population and destroy us, you know. So therefore we got to stop marijuana. And it kind of goes on like this. Actually, the peak of marijuana use was, as I said, in the 70s. But that was rich kids, so you don't throw them in jail. You know, and then it got seriously criminalized. You know, you really throw people in jail for it when it was poor people. I mean, that's roughly the history. The detailed history is quite interesting. I once heard a speech. There's a legal historian, a guy named, I think, Charles Whitebread or something, who teaches now at UCLA, who's the main historian of marijuana. And I once heard a speech that he was giving to the judges of California. You know, he was talking about the history of marijuana. This is about 10 years ago. He made a prediction. He said he predicted that tobacco was going to be criminalized in the United States. And the reason was it was becoming class-related. And when a drug, historically, when a drug has become class-related, it generally gets criminalized. And in fact, something like that's happening.